Hello.
Hey.
Hi. I'm trying to get online. Kind of. How are you?
I don't know why my video is not working. I'm sorry.
It's all right. We'll forgive you. Hang on. Okay. I'm only going to stay on a very short time. I'm going to let you all get on with the call. But I wanted to say hello. And I'm sitting at the foundation. I'm going to get feedback in just a minute. So hang on.
Can't believe your voice is still crazy like that.
I know it's a horrible thing. And I keep having to talk. So that's
okay?
so good, right? Oh, but I have like a little care package. Wait, I have to show you. Here, look. That's D. Hey Jeff, why are you Beth?
I joined with a link that Beth shared in Slack.
I copied it from the meeting invite. I wouldn't mind living in California.
Let's see, can I change my... Let's see if I can change my name. Rename. There.
Right. Hang on. Oh, good, you did it. Okay. I should be off here now. Why am I still on? How weird. Okay. So we're in the ESHIP design session. It's exciting, right?
So I want to make sure I'm on the right call. Is this the 6.2 storytelling call?
It's 6.
It's 6. Oh, this is just plain old goal 6 call?
Plain old goal 6 call.
Well, okay. Well, I calendared it, so I'll stay on for now.
Oh my gosh.
I thought it was the little initiative, that the storytelling 6.2 project that we were doing, Beth.
I don't know. Okay.
Okay. Well, I will stick on for a bit anyway.
So Jeff, congratulations on co-starters.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Okay. So I have to go back into the other session. So I just wanted to call and say welcome. And I'm going to get a Post-it. And I want you to tell me as a opening question. Think about this. As we design the 2020 ESHIP Summit, what is it that you want the design team to know? And I will start with Beth.
Good boy. What do we want the design team to know?
Or to keep in mind, or to think about, or whatever.
That requires some thought.
It does. I guess for a quick answer, I would say last year was awesome with the band, and we got to move around a little bit more. And I think keeping a focus more on engagement is good. So I'm not saying we necessarily need a lot more moving around and interaction, but keeping that in the front and center, I think, is great. And
more interaction.
Yeah, more moving around, more back and forth between the attendees. You know, they reduced the sage on the stage quite a bit last year, and I think that was a good thing.
Okay.
So I will popcorn to, let's go with that.
Was that me, did you say?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just thinking about that. I think I would like, since we're in the deliver phase, I think I'd like to see more interactive sessions, like Beth said, but that focus on practical things that ecosystem builders can to take home and incorporate into their communities. So just brainstorming here, what if for each one of the goals and initiatives we had, say we had a little groups form around success stories around inclusive, diverse ecosystems, how people share how the programs they've done that have been successful around increasing diversity and inclusion, or groups that have had successful PR campaigns like Erie, Pennsylvania, or promoting awareness among policymakers. So things like that would be practical tips that we need to crowdsource the success stories and things that have worked in the goals and initiatives and share those more broadly, I think. Chad. Let's go with Chad.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Jeff. Interesting question, because I think ESHIP is a bit of a crossroads as we see the overall ecosystem building and the two directions it can go. It could go practical, building on the things that are coming out of ESHIP, or it could double back down what's next for the system level. I think the first year in particular, it was a fundamental shift for the system. We've seen a lot of things in BIA and a few other entities start coming up with standards and development. My concern is if everybody gets down to practical building out the artifacts and the individual aspects, we're not going to say, well, what's next for the overall system, the global system of the innovation ecosystem. And Kaufman is one of maybe about 2 or 3 entities globally that's really in a position to focus on that. So if it does go down to practical building of lessons learned and case studies and that kind of thing, which I think is important, there may still be a gap, which then starts going into the UN and a few of the other larger entities, which I don't think have the practical relevance to drive the system forward. So I don't know if I have an answer for it. My encouragement, what I'd be looking for personally would be more at the system level. How do we progress and continue that conversation while I also acknowledging the need? But it's a massive task on the other end of actually building capability in individual ecosystem leaders around all the aspects, such as the goals that we have. So those two sides. That's it for me. Hassan.
Hi. So actually, I'd have to give this a little more thought, but I really like Jeff's idea about taking projects that have already started or initiatives that have already started and have had some traction, and sharing those out so that people who are newly arriving to the ESHIP community or folks who have not been as engaged before can go back to their communities with something that they can start working on right away. And then that can also be a learning experience to learn from all of these people on future calls, what's working, what's not working, how have they modified what was presented at ESHIP. So I think that presents a good opportunity. I'm trying to see who, Kelly.
Oh.
So I'll pop on over.
Oh, hi, Kelly. The question for you and Scott is, as we talk about designing the next ESHIP Summit, what is it that you want us to think about and keep in mind or work towards? No pressure.
Let me defer to Scott to go first and let me think about it for a minute.
All right, Scott, you're on. Go ahead.
Just rephrase the question. Sorry, I apologize.
Okay.
I was playing
No,
machine.
and we liked your hat. As we look towards designing the next ESHIP Summit, what is it that you would like us to think about, keep in mind, work towards? What would be helpful?
A couple of things from my orbits. I've only been in the New York area a couple of years. I've been in Dubai for 8 years prior to that, and across MENA. So I will share a couple of things that could be useful. In the local New York, Westchester area, I think peer review would be really useful. And what I mean by that is a number of the programs or projects here have organic history, but they haven't dealt with other people who've necessarily done it. So it's really good to have a conversation with somebody who's across something that the people think are new. And I'll give you just one simple example. Westchester Economic Development Authority did their first incubator that was a virtual incubator this year called E46. And E46 collected 10 people and they had a demo day. Of course, none of you know about the demo day and none of you saw any of the things because they didn't share it with anybody. It was a local event. And therefore, in my view, kind of like a college graduation, it's one and done. There's no value add sharing to anybody else that could help somebody else with what either the ventures were, the lessons learned, or from the rest of the world taking it here. And it's mainly because people become so sun-centric. The world revolves around me, at least in what I would be aware. The second piece is the value that this kind of group and the ESHIP Summit and the activities that are going on in terms of challenges is to create a resource that's dynamic, live, and available. Most of the people I talk to don't know about this group and don't know about these resources. So it's how do you communicate those would be very valuable. And I've seen some of that in the playbook, but most of it is a statement of we have it, not how do we get it to the people that need it.
Okay, now you get to popcorn. Back to Kelly, or who is the 608 number?
That's Scott.
Scott Resnick?
Scott Resnick. Scott Resnick, 608.
All right, hang on. All right, Kelly, go.
Okay. I guess some of my thoughts are, I know it was planned, so it wasn't a lot of talking at the audience. However, I attended the Rural Rise, which was in this past September. And what I really liked there was the quick pitches. And that's where an organization would come up and they would have 5 minutes to talk about what they were doing in their community. And that was great to really hear examples of what was happening, boots on the ground examples throughout the nation, so that you could later say, oh, okay, that's the face of someone I need to connect with now. Otherwise, it's just random conversations when you're networking, trying to figure out if you have a common goal or, have some of the same shared problems and obstacles that you're facing. And so I think having some time for quick pitches would be really, really good, beneficial.
Excellent. Okay, so Scott, the question is, as the team here is working towards designing the next ESHIP Summit, what is it that you would like us to think about, keep in mind, consider?
Oh, that's a great. I wish I had my notes that I've emailed Andy on this subject. So I thought whoever said the peer review idea, I think that is a fantastic component. I think it's a really good idea. So I've done three ESHIPs before, and what I would say is the beneficial pieces are when you're learning from, each ecosystem is a bit at a different stage. And it's as many conversations that you can get in with ecosystems that are a little bit ahead of yours and a little bit behind yours, where I think you can have the most impact. For Madison, there are still a lot of things that we can learn, but there's a lot of other areas that we can share backwards too. It's a little bit different when you're in a community that has none of the same ingredients or are just in a very different place. So I would just keep that in perspective as you're setting up groups and you're able to interact with those various groups. I thought that was done really well in some of the earlier summits, just in general. I also understand the benefits of setting it up by region, but I think it has a lot more to do with time and space than geographic location.
I really like that. Thank you so much, everyone. So I'm going to get back to actually the design meeting. So it's really helpful to have all of you input. I'm going to turn it over to Hassan and Beth and Jeff, if he's so chosen to help facilitate this call, which is more, I think today, more about what's actually working in your ecosystem, and share out some examples of what you see working, what you don't see working, and maybe learn from each other. I think that in a future call, it would be great to have Scott talk about his experience in other communities around the world and the stuff that he's teaching on. I think that it's great to have Chad talk about what's going on a global sphere. And before I go, I want to congratulate Chad on his engagement. So we're going to publicly put it out there. Chad got engaged over the weekend, so yay, Chad. And so I'm going to turn this over to Hassan. I'm going to take my notes back to the group and share it out. So I appreciate that. And hopefully I'll be able to save my voice for the next call. So Hassan, I am making you host, and this call is being recorded so that we can keep talking. But I will bid you a good day and wish you all well in continuing this discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Okay, so hello everyone. I know a lot of us have been on calls together, so I think most of us know each other. I am Hassan Bazi. I am an ecosystem builder in Detroit. Also, the co-host on this call is Beth. And Beth, if you just want to chime in.
Hey, everybody. I'm happy to be here. And it seems like this date came around really, really fast this time, but anxious to hear what's going on in Southeast Michigan with regard to universal support building there, and anyone else that has some good things to share with us. One kind of a housekeeping, is anyone able to serve as scribe today? And if you wouldn't mind just scribing outside of the agenda, because as I looked at the link to the agenda, it's October's, and I'm not quite sure how to edit that without making a mess. So if we could have a scribe, like in Word or something else, to get to us, then I'll commit to updating the actual agenda. Anyone?
Any takers?
I can do it for a little bit, but I've got to leave early. So
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, and as I'm talking, I'll try to take down some notes as well as best as I can.
let's see.
That's the same. It's just difficult to engage and write.
Yeah.
Keep up.
Okay, so last month we had a wonderful presentation from Kelly Fitzgerald from the Launchpad. Kelly's on the call. Thank you, Kelly. So this month, what we thought we would do is share some of what's happening in Southeast Michigan around this goal, particularly activating local foundations. Because we have in Southeast Michigan, the foundation world is pretty active in entrepreneurship and ecosystem support. And some of this, I know others on this call have also been on some of the other calls, so some of this might be a repeat of what you've heard on some of the other calls, but all of the calls and the goals are pretty much related, so it's relevant to different conversations. So in Southeast Michigan, we have an initiative out of the local community foundation, and that initiative is called the New Economy Initiative, NEI. And NEI's mission is to grow the culture of entrepreneurship in Southeast Michigan that benefits all residents and strengthens the regional economy. And NEI is a special project to the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan, which is a philanthropy-led entrepreneurial development strategy working to build an inclusive network of support for entrepreneurs and small businesses in Southeast Michigan. The collaboration that forms NEI is 13 national and local foundations, and I'm just going to go over real quickly who they are, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the work and the support behind it. So it's the Charles S. Mott Foundation, Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, the Ford Foundation, Hudson Weber Foundation, the Knight Foundation, Kresge, the Fisher Foundation, the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, the McGregor Fund, the Skillman Foundation, and CERDNA. So those 13 local and national foundations help support and provide funding for the New Economy Initiative to do its work. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that NEI has done. So in Southeast Michigan, I think this work really came about as a result of a vacuum that we had in leadership in municipal government in Detroit, which was a result of a bankruptcy and the mayor being under indictment going back about six years now. So the foundation world kind of filled the vacuum that was left by municipal government and started to take on leadership role in funding and providing support to activate entrepreneurship and small business support in and around Detroit. And a lot of that has been led by NEI, the New Economy Initiative. And to give you an idea of some of the things that NEI does, so recently, I think this was about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, NEI holds annual convenings of folks in the ecosystem. So this brings together about 100, the last one brought together about 100 different people, and these were people that ranged from business support organizations, universities, CDFIs, storytellers, workforce development people, people providing capital. So it was just about most of the players in the ecosystem in and around Detroit. And it's a full day convening of learning, basically networking to interact with each other, hearing best practices, stories, and ideas about things that different organizations are doing. And I'm going to share, actually, I'm going to have to find the link, but there's a report that NEI released called Community of Opportunity. And this was released this summer, and I'll share the link. It's online. It's if you go to the NEI website, I'm just going to have to find the link to share, but it's called the NEI Community of Opportunity Report. And basically it's a scan of entrepreneurship support assets in Southeast Michigan. So at this convening, which NEI holds every year, so NEI, in terms of convening folks in the ecosystem, so there's this annual convening of folks in the ecosystem. There's also a collaborative work table, which NEI convenes, and it's basically a collaborative work table of folks in the ecosystem, and that happens quarterly. So 4 times a year, some of those people who attend this annual convening get together to talk about challenges that they're having, to share things that they've done. And out of that work table, there are committees that have formed. So subgroups that actually focus on very specific addressing challenges in the ecosystem. And those groups meet monthly. So I co-chair one of those committees, and I'm involved in the 3 committees that have come out of that work table. So one of the committees is around policy. Another committee is around gaps in the ecosystem. And 3rd committee is around collaboration in the ecosystem. So every one of those committees works on specific projects. So the GAPS committee has identified capital as a gap in the ecosystem, the digital divide, and forgetting what the third one is, but there's a third one there. And so those committees have been around for a few years now. And in those few years, they've now, the latest iteration is those committees are kind of have all morphed into one committee because the policies affecting the gaps are affected by policy. Capital is one of the gaps. So all of these three committees have now combined and are working together to address. So the policy committee works on addressing some of the gaps that have been identified that are gaps as a result of policy or systemic things in the ecosystem. So that's, like, in a nutshell, those are some of the things that NEI has worked on to sort of bring together the folks in the ecosystem and make sure folks are talking to each other, addressing challenges, working on projects and sharing learning with each other. And it's almost similar to some of the things that we've talked about in other goals around regional convenings, except this is a local convening of folks in the region. So similar to that. And I think, like, when I think of some of the work that NEI is doing and this conversation, and especially this goal, a lot of the, and we've talked about this on other calls, a lot of the goals and the initiatives are interconnected. And for example, Jeff's on a call, and storytelling kind of weaves its way through all of the goals. Although it sits separately as work being done separately, it also weaves into all of the other goals that we're working on. So I don't want to keep talking. If there's any, let's, I mean, I'd rather have this be a conversation. So if you have any questions or ideas, let's all talk about it. And Beth, if you want to chime in, or there's anything that you think of that I missed, feel free to jump in.
Thank you. I will just jump in for a second. Hassan, if you wouldn't mind sharing, what your thoughts are, what your opinion or your knowledge is with regard to how these convenings have become successful. Is it simply because the folks with the wallet are calling the meetings, and how would you or NEI recommend that other communities figure this out?
Yeah, I think the fact early on, that the folks with the big wallets and that were funding a lot of the activity were calling the convenings brought a lot of people to the table. But I think as it stands now, I think a lot of people actually come to the table and come to these convenings and participate because there is value that comes out of all of it. But I think initially in the onset, it was probably the power of the folks holding the purse strings that were able to bring people to the table, because not all, but some of the organizations that were participating were receiving grants from either NEI or some of the other funders of NEI. So I think they probably felt compelled to participate early on. But I think now a lot of people actually do get value out of the convenings. And I mean, I've participated in these work tables and convenings for probably about 5 or 6 years. And I mean, every convening, there are new people in the ecosystem, and it's a way, I mean, it keeps your relationships fresh because it's a way to bring people together, and people that you otherwise would not interact with unless you somehow had a reason intentionally to interact with them. So it brings everybody into one room, and you meet a lot of new people who have come into the ecosystem who you probably wouldn't meet unless you were out there and you ran into somebody or there was a reason to reach out to someone.
Thank you. I'm thinking, how do we use this example to help the rest of us across the country build universal support? And is there a foundation of foundations that all foundations look to for leadership and best practices that NEI could actually, tell the story, and they could be held up as, hey, communities across the country, check this out. And these are the results. If you're not doing this, you're going to be behind.
Yeah, I know that they have talked to other communities outside of Michigan. Back about five years ago, NEI was also funded the initial iteration of Forward Cities, which Detroit was one of the cities. NEI was one of the local funders, so they participated in that initiative and shared what was happening in Detroit with some of the other cities that were involved. It was 4 cities at that time. It was Cleveland, Detroit, New Orleans, and Durham. Yeah, so I feel confident saying that they have in the past shared what they've done with other communities, and I'd be happy to make a connection if anyone was interested in having that information connected to their local foundation.
Thank you.
Hassan, 2 questions if I can.
Yep.
One, in a year, how much would the 7 foundations support NEI with? 50K or 500K?
So, I'm looking at the numbers here on a report, and it says since 2007, those 13 foundations that I mentioned have contributed $159 million to NEI's efforts. So since 2007, so in the last 12 years, those 13 foundations have contributed $159 million.
Okay. So here's a thought for the ESHIP Summit, if I was going to pick a subject that's dear and near to almost everybody's heart. I would guess that everyone needs funding for their local communities. Therefore, it would be really cool to see if there were reports that are given back to stakeholders that show return on investment and identify the better ones so that we could create a dividend payback reporting impact, a better model for communicating back to those people that contribute. Because sadly, I think all too often we ask for money or we ask for co-funding, but we don't give back to those groups something that's useful for them to communicate how they've been successful.
That's a very good point. I think there may be, and I'd have to go back and look at some of their old reports, but I think NEI may have put together something to that effect in one of their reports about, but I'd have to go back and look and see where that's at. But I think, yeah, that's a really good point.
If I may piggyback on another thought that might be a benefit for NEI and elsewhere, just in my past bumblings, I ran into a group and worked with them for a while called Joint Venture Silicon Valley, JVSV. It sounds and smells a bit like NEI, but the approach that they took was CEOs in the community had to sign a joint initiative and work together. And they had to put in some funding to the community as well as be on the board of the organization, hence why it was called a joint venture. And what they ended up doing was actually getting down on their hands and knees and helping work with the people rather than just delegating to other people in their organization. So it was the senior executives for the companies taking a view that fixing education in East Palo Alto was essential. It wasn't a just give money and turn your head the other way. And they went and helped work with the teachers to figure out what they needed. And then many of the organizations ended up engineering tools to give them. But the reason it was called joint venture, I think, is a very good name for a community rather than the alphabet soup we normally have. So if it's joint venture Detroit, it's an agenda to work in that area together, not just 5 foundations or whatever it is. And obviously you've had 13 or a whole gaggle of them for that amount of money, but it was an approach that seemed to work. They've survived and changed the people that are on the board and the organization and their agenda. And if you just Google joint venture Silicon Valley, it's a resource, and I would encourage that they might be a good speaker at the E-Summit. And one of the individuals who is now the economic development head for San Jose, and her name's going to come to me in just a moment, used to work for the group that came up with a new variant of cluster work out of Stanford Research Institute. And they piloted, tested, and she's done it around the world. And the reason I was linking it to the foundation is one of the groups that helped fund a lot of this work was the Irvine Foundation. So they created reports back to Irvine explaining what the impact was, not just taking their money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that, that point, Scott. And one of the questions I'll put out there for both Hassan, Scott, and anyone else is quite often we see funding bodies give money, whether from government, universities, foundations, philanthropic, even BC. And if they give money to the people supporting startups, those people quite often don't have the sophistication, like measuring E&L and just basic financial modeling business is hard, like a cafe, but then all of a sudden we get to social impact and overall outcomes. That's a whole nother level of application that as an entire industry, it doesn't know how to do, much less some person just trying to give it a go and help entrepreneurs without the background. So how do we, as a venture concept, and I like the idea of a bunch of CEOs coming together, not just say, let's create a pool and give you a bunch of money, because we see so often where that have the impact we want, because it's just this money over the top of a bunch of noise. They have to figure out how to spend it and then figure out how to measure. How if we give them money and with that give them the capability and start building capacity for them to report back. I'll add two other things briefly here. One of them is it can quite often create a vicious cycle where I give them money, I don't have a way to report. We don't know what happened to it. Second round comes up, I don't get the money again, therefore I can't hire the resources to report. As compared to, I get the money, I find a way to report, I get my nice graphs and 10-page outcome. I get the second round of the money, I can hire someone, which helps me report, and it creates a virtuous cycle. And the second one, practical experience, I built a platform which helped programs measure their impact through surveys and dashboards, providing access to the funding body. Similar to the hockey stick model in Canada. Challenges is that they didn't mandate that platform would be used. And so the government encouraged people to use the platform of the places they gave 150, 250,000 to, but it was optional. And they didn't have the data, and it was messy, and it was hard for them to onboard because they weren't prepared. And so there wasn't a lot of uptake. Whereas if they would have mandated saying, we'll give you the money, so therefore you must have some sort of measurement approach. So I'd be interested, again, I'll just throw it out there. To what extent do we have almost strings attached to the money saying you will get our help, or we will mandate a measurement approach, or we're going to partner with you, not just on how to get the outcomes, but how to report on the outcomes, and where is that line drawn? Because otherwise you could say from a funding body, that's your business, you deal with it. And if you don't do it, I'll just give them money to someplace else in an open market. And I'm not sure that's working.
Well, that's a really good point, Chad. So part of NEI's reporting, so NEI had a platform that all of their grantees utilized to report their metrics in. And as part of every grant that NEI issued, there was an evaluation part attached to that. So NEI had an evaluator that they were working with that evaluated every one of the grantees' work at the end of the grant cycle.
That's good.
Also, I think there is a goal around metrics and measurements for the entire ESHIP initiative, correct? That they're focused on what those metrics and measurements should look like. Goal 5 that he just showed.
I think there is, but I don't think there is for the foundations. The reason I was picking that one is how do we give our investors a acknowledgement in the way that they want it versus a certificate and here's the 5 stats we did, which are inside the tent, versus they need something that helps them go to the CSR committee and helps them show what their impact is.
Okay.
So I think there is an ecosystem set of metrics, but it's harder to find a good partner who says, I got what I wanted from my community that I invested in.
Okay. I know one thing here locally, because we've struggled with, for lack of a better term, the squishy stuff that you can't really put on a number to. And what we've started to do in our report outs is tell stories. It's not anything creative. It's not anything that's like heartwarming. It's just you put a little more context behind what the numbers are and what your activities were that week. And so we have like this narrative at the beginning that kind of has more information about what those numbers mean. So it's not, I don't think we're always going to have those specific numbers, metrics, but I think having the squishy stuff and more of a storytelling is a good way to do that.
So I'll draw two strings together on this one. I like the squishy approach and the stories. And I'm going to draw Chad in on this. Part of the reason Chad's interesting to me in Australia is he's a squishy guy. And he helps collect the stories of the communities and puts them in a report, because for most local communities, it's boring and overhead. For somebody who's from the outside and interested in it, it's curious and novel. The locals don't see it the same way as an outsider does. So one thing I would observe is often the squishy story is better to have somebody who's not sitting in Southeast Michigan write the report or the story, because they're so caught up in the local lead in the pipes, bad, local politician, blah, 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 that they can't even see what they did good because they're so consumed in the poison of the local. Whereas an outsider goes, wow, you guys really did create with Genucy and Shinola, two really cool businesses that set up a local thing, blah, 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 blah. Which they go, yeah.
Yeah, it is getting that balance of the qualitative and the quantitative, absolutely. And both extremes aren't going to work. Your numbers can be boring, numbers can lie, but they also don't tell the whole story, and they're not necessarily going to sell the heart. And a lot of decisions are made based on the heart. But by the same token, we see too often where the same 2 or 3 narratives keep getting rolled out, and we rely on that as a proof point. And that can mask some structural challenges in the ecosystem. I think that's the next evolution for where we're going with measurement, is really finding a blend of those two. We see globally both the only 2 global approaches to survey-esque type, apart from the ones that focus specifically on accelerators and incubators, is GEM and Genome, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, the national surveys, and then Genome. Interesting with Genome, I think price point is prohibitive for regional areas at the moment, but still as a storytelling device to really compare across and highlight the strengths. I like also how they do it, where they don't really emphasize that this one's better or worse, but here's what's really great about this one, and here's what's really great about this one, and then we compare strengths. So again, I don't know if I have the answer for it, but I think as we continue to move forward, blending those two is going to be pretty critical.
Might be a really good idea to have some Goal 5 representation talk on the next call.
Yep.
The only thing that I would add, so we ended up raising upwards of around 80 million for our entrepreneurial center. And in that process, we obviously had to both report out, but where I see organizations getting astray, and actually I'm not a huge fan of the previous 2 organizations mentioned, the problem becomes of understanding what your KPIs are, your key performance indicators of what you're trying to accomplish with the dollars that you're putting forward. And I think so often when you're writing in the grant phase, it becomes more of a process of, what are we asking for? What are we going to get an answer to make someone say yes? And then did our programs actually measure properly? And as someone who works on the metrics for the Startup Champions Network and in touch with the Kauffman folks doing metrics, I think there's some misunderstanding of how do you actually measure effectiveness and how often it is actually pretty difficult to move some of these needles. So, I don't know if that adds to this conversation, but what I would just say is, really diving into KPIs, setting that what should your goal be and what are some of those outcomes are equally as valuable, and where I see many centers across the country go astray, quite frankly.
Does anyone know if there is, and I might have the name of this somewhere in my notes, it seems like there is a community, not a community, a foundation, a national foundation that everyone looks to for best practices in community and economic development?
Kauffman
Foundation. There's Kauffman.
But for
Aspen.
what about broader economic development focus?
So as someone who works with another major family office, Kauffman is the one that folks are, at least from the family office perspective, looks to. Kauffman has other roles and that they've played in the past to really hone in on this, and then in other years they pulled back. So I would say we're probably in a pullback period, but similar to ESHIP, there are summits that are directed essentially to this topic that Kauffman has run in the past. And I would otherwise say the National Family Offices Association would be the other org that folks like the Ford Foundation and others look to. Aspen would also be on that list, the Aspen Institute.
Yeah, and also acknowledging the like what we're talking about here with entrepreneur support is a niche within economic development portfolio. You've got a broader overall, large corporates and different economic impacts, and you also have community development. And the interesting part about what Kauffman does is it bridges that gap between community and economic. Other ones just focus on economic and investor type and whatnot. And then you also have MIT, who's doing some interesting things with their regional entrepreneurship acceleration programs, and some stuff with Stern that he's doing out there. Aspen, as was mentioned, Nesta over in Europe, and Startup Commons, which is doing some stuff around standards. And then you start getting some national overall, and then some stuff with the OECD that's coming out in broader terms as we keep moving up.
OACD?
I'm sure there's more that I haven't thought of. Say again?
OACD, is that what you said?
OECD. And they do a lot of documentation on like the definition of startup, the definition of metrics, the definition of like really at the standards level. So they essentially do write the standards on a lot of these things.
What's their website?
I'll put some stuff in the links.
Thank you. So I guess what I'm getting at is can we get, we mentioned obviously Kauffman, the National Offices Association, Aspen Institute, MIT, Stern, Nesta, OECD, and whoever else. Can we pull those organizations together, or would Kauffman be willing to pull those organizations together to say, hey, help us help the rest of the country understand what the opportunity is here? Look at the outcomes from Southeast Michigan. Look at the outcomes from the Launch Place and other best practices where the community foundations or national foundations have come together to create this awesome, thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem for these regions across the country. I think it shouldn't be rocket science to be able to do that, or am I crazy?
Knowing that Kauffman has done this in the past, and and I'm talking more historically in the last 15, 20 years, I would just ask the question, why did Kauffman stop bringing these players all together?
That's a really good question. Does anyone have any information on that, or that's an Andy question, I guess?
It might be like a Wendy question or previous leadership question.
Okay.
I guess we can pose that question to Andy and see if he knows.
And I think like a couple of things come to mind. One of them, like I know when I've had chats with Andy in the past, like they are Kansas City, and then now they're expanding broader in the U.S. And they do engage a bit globally to learn and understand, but they are the Kauffman Foundation with a remit for their local area. Interested broadly in entrepreneurship. Same thing with Nesta over in the UK, who does, they fund some things outside, but it can be a challenge to do a broad stroke. Like there's a session next week that Startup Commons is hosting in Helsinki, where they're writing open standards on startup activity. So these things are happening. It's just finding that entity that has a legitimate accountability and remit. Because as soon as you look to that, then like you got to focus your scarce resource on something. Like when we talk about Kauffman, but really it is Andy and maybe 2 or 3 people. And there's that constant tension on where we focus our attention. I only have so much time and funds to focus on. And the other thing, I'm just bringing it back to the topic of the call of universal support. Like there is a session on metrics where this is the narrative that happens. But then how do we support we talked before about the funding bodies providing platforms and tools, but it's almost like we need an additional way to then educate and inform the funding bodies on here's some of the KPIs and things to measure. Like Scott's dead on as far as getting the underlying KPIs, Genome and GEM and all those. They're just a platform and a tool, and it's putting tools out there. But how do we educate on what are the common things we need to measure? And that is some good work that Kauffman is doing currently with other reports, partnering with SourceLink and a few others, and co-starters getting in there and creating some of the mechanisms by which these things happen. So it's all a body work. How we participate and support it, and then also from a universal support perspective, educate the people providing the funding to make it more accessible.
And thankfully, I think this goal's role is more towards the helping educate folks versus in partnership with the quantifiable and qualitative methods, right?
I think it is, but I'll pose one group, and I only know them through a couple of angles of participation and observation, is Endeavor. Endeavor globally has an approach of doing kind of the opposite of what we're doing. They only pick the stars. They're after the gazelles that create the biggest impact to the community. But they also have a different model for board members in each country. Depending on where you are, roughly they require $100,000 per year per board member to be a local board member. And you have to put in your time. You can't delegate. So it's a CEO that puts in the time and the money, and therefore they're trying to help work the ecosystem. But their aim is to pick 2 or 3 stars in every country and support them to be successful. Now that creates a virtuous cycle, to use the phrase that Chad was talking about earlier, and I think Scott was, relative to the feedback loops in the community. But to me, that puts a hypothesis and an impact together. Rather than trying to solve every problem in an ecosystem, their agenda is to find a leverage point, invest in that, create that model and reproduce it around the world, and then report back to everybody what they've done. Now, they've also added one other thing in my view that's kind of smart that we may want to consider, is they've partnered with a group called Bain. At least I think recently they have done that. where they help do the analysis and reporting back as part of their contribution to the program. So they get a professional level report done for impact. It's not done by the inside people as one additional task I have to do after I've done all the hard work is do my impact report. So it's an interesting approach that they've chosen a slice, in my view, that gets impact. They ask for money from key players and they give them a report and they share the report publicly. So there's a higher level of transparency because they're trying to say, this is a method we want to see scale and we'll tell you who we picked and why we picked them. So I'm just suggesting that there is a less is sometimes more in the challenges we may want to tackle in ecosystems, because if we go solve everything, we should be government.
I think that's a really good point on solving a few particular issues inside an ecosystem. One other thought that I had while you're sharing, and Kaufman unfortunately scrapped this project. I mean, they did have an author who was contracted to write essentially a book on a number of different ecosystems and unique projects towards economic development. Essentially, 18 chapters, 16 of them focused on different ecosystems. And I think that adds a certain amount of gravitas to those communities who are not only being profiled, but what's working in that. It's a project that I wish would have continued, primarily because Madison was one that was profiled. So I have a selfish reason there. But another thing that we're also, for another organization that I do work with, is we will profile different startup communities and looking at different peer metrics. However, the rules about being in that organization, you're able to, basically, I get assigned a community that is not Madison for Madison to be included inside the data sets, which creates a peer review system of what's working, what's not working, and taking in survey data. I think it's an interesting model, because a lot of what we're talking about is how do you pull together, the metrics that matter in a way that will be both impartial but also effective to be able to communicate. And it usually takes someone outside of your region, but you do need enough of an incentive structure to get your own region also, or your own program also indexed and measured.
That's pretty cool, Scott. What's the name of that organization?
So that's actually how the Startup Champions Network works on our data committee. So yeah, I have to do 10 report outs for other communities, and that way I ensure Madison gets included in mine, plus they also then get, 8 to 9 other cities also covered. So we had 5 of us all working under that model.
Okay, that's cool. Well, we've got a lot of good information here, and I'm sorry, but we're like on the hour, pretty close. So any last parting thoughts? I guess maybe Hassan, do you have a popcorn question for the end?
Actually, I didn't. I guess if there's any quick updates that anybody has on any initiatives or anything related to the initiatives under Goal 6 that they want to share, feel free to do that.
Yeah, I think we have 6.2 and 6.5 as project teams that are moving forward, and we were trying to get the groups together over the past several weeks, and it's just been very difficult. So still herding the cats and expect calls hopefully in time to have a new update for the December call. We are having a December call, correct?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, because I believe this one falls with enough time before the holidays for us to have it. So.
Okay, so I know it's 6.2. Thank you to Jeff Bennett. He did create a story to share the example of how a community has used PR campaign or marketing campaign to educate their community so that they support the notion that entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial development is important. And that would happen to be Erie. So that's out there if anyone wants to grab it and share it with their colleagues and peers, just to show that that kind of effort can work. And on 6.5, we're still looking for more examples like NEI and the Launch Place of foundations that have been supporting and figuring out how we can, again, like I said earlier, get some heavy hitters together to influence the rest of the country's foundations to start really supporting this work.
I'd be happy. I know I'm sharing next meeting from Starting Blocks perspective, but I'd be happy to share around our some of the materials that we create around our metrics, just to be able to show an example of some of our selling points that we use.
That's cool. And is it something that you worked on with the Goal 5 team as well? The metrics
No,
tool?
this is something we have to do because otherwise we won't have money. So it's out of a necessity more than anything else.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of interesting. I think there are foundations out there that are funding work, but funding it not as part of a collaborative in a very targeted way and in specific regions around very specific projects. And I think if that was shared with other foundations and those foundations collectively worked on a project in a region, I think this would be, I don't want to say easier, but it would be easier to pull together than it would appear, because a lot of these foundations are funding work, but they're funding it independently on very specific projects, but they all relate to what we're talking about on this call, but they're doing it on their own individually.
Right. Okay.
Blackstone would be another one to bring to the table, both with their trials and now how they focus their funding efforts.
Okay, so I'm hearing that we have 3 opportunities to focus on for next call. Scott and Resnick and Madison has offered to share what they measure and report out on to continue their capacity building and sustainability. We can invite someone from the Goal 5 team to talk about the progress that they're making and some best practices that they've heard. And we can reach out to Andy to reach out to Wendy to talk about why don't they convene the foundations across the country anymore, and is there opportunity to do that in view of our need for universal support? That would be a pretty aggressive agenda. So is there a majority of folks that want to vote on 1 or 2?
All 3.
All 3? Cool. I have one more thing to say, and then I'll let you guys go, and Hassan, you can close this, but how the heck do you copy the chat?
I'm not sure how to do that.
Right, just highlight it all with your cursor, Control C, and Control V, paste it into.
Yeah.
And I just threw a link in there. I think it just got released maybe on the time of our phone call, the Index for Dynamic Entrepreneurship, in part with the Global Entrepreneurship Network, but based on the OECD frameworks comparing nations. So that's also a good one just to see a national comparison, and but also the narrative that they have in there as far as the thought leadership on how you measure and how we compare and what their perspective is. So might be an interesting read. I've only just scanned it.
Thanks,
Thank
Chad.
you.
Okay, so I think
Cool.
unless there's anything else, I think we're about 5 minutes over. Is everyone good to end here? All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you on the next call.
See you soon.
Thank
See
you.
guys.
All right.